Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Today we have Jessa Lingle from Rutgers University, who's going to talk about transgressive mobilities. Ladies and gentlemen, Jessa Lingle.
Thank you, and thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to share my work with you today. I want to start off by making the claim that whether we're talking about a design standpoint or an end-user standpoint, or more of a conceptual standpoint, it's really important not to essentialize technology. Because generalizations about technology, like glossing over differences in how people use technology or not recognizing the ideology embedded in technological production, can lead us to make some really big mistakes in terms of how people might be using it. If you want to design a technology that can serve a wide group of people, or if you want to make technology in an ethically responsible way, or from a critical theory perspective. From a critical theory perspective, differences in how people use or even in how people talk about technology can point us to important differences of things like power and privilege and legitimacy. So, for example, one way that we have of talking about things like information inequality is this phrase, the digital divide. And it's a term that has a lot of popular traction, but it can be really problematic because it sets up this binary between people who do and do not have, the haves and the have-nots. And it sort of implies that the problem is just access to technology rather than things like maybe fluency in technology. So rather than identifying who's using technology or the barriers to people getting to access or to use technology, I'm more interested in questions of why some groups of people use technology in radically different ways than others, and what those differences tell us about underlying cultural logics that give rise to these differences of power and privilege. So in dealing with these questions, I bring two theoretical backgrounds to bear. So the first is a background in critical theory, and more specifically in gender studies and literary theory. And this is a background that has really basically given me the tools to engage questions of power dynamics and ideology embedded into everyday life. So that's one disciplinary background. On the other background, I have both a professional and an academic background in library and information science. And that shaped my interest in applying those theoretical tools to phenomenon of information practices and technological use. If you're curious, this is Michel Desserteau. I'll be talking about him a little bit later. This is S.R. Ranganathan, one of my favorite librarians of all time. If you don't get the inside joke, he created this system he created the 5 laws of library science, which I will just tell you right now are books are for use, every reader its book, every book its reader, save the time of the reader, and the library is a growing organism. So the 5 laws, and he created a faceted system, which we actually use all the time, but we don't call it that, so that's the colon. So that's my very nerdy inside joke of posse people. No. It is not an organ. It is a system of punctuation. As far as I know, somehow that's escaped a lot of the library literature that comes down to us as professionals. I don't know why. I could talk about S.R. Ranganathan all day, but I will instead talk about some of these things, right? The critical theory background and the library theory background, the tools for asking questions and then asking those questions of certain things like technology and information. So more specifically, I bring these backgrounds together and ask questions like, what technologies emerge to meet the needs of some groups over others? How and why are some information practices and technological protocols legitimized over others? And what possibilities are there for resistance, reappropriation, and play? And when I tackle these questions, I tend to do it from the level of community or shared subject position. So for example, I studied communities of practice. So how do DJs organize their music? Communities of practice like software engineers and the extent to which they perceive their work as craft. That was a project I did this past summer with Tim Regan at the other Cambridge Microsoft lab. And YouTube users, people who take videos at concerts and post them on YouTube. So these are communities bound together by technological practice.
So you did an internship together?
Mm-hmm. Ye old, as Tim Regan sent me an email saying, like, come be my intern at MSR Cambridge. Ye old, not Massachusetts. And I was like, you goofball. He's great. Communities bound in place. So I studied the punk rock music scene in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And also the research I'll be sharing with you today, transnational migrants in New York. And communities of alterity. So I did a project on health information seeking of homeless women in San Francisco. And also the project I did here as a summer intern, how do you keep secrets online in the extreme body modification community. I just want to point out that despite the fact that it's on this neat table, the lines between place and alterity and place and practice are by no means hard and fast, right? So if you're studying the New Brunswick music scene, it's important to understand that there's a relationship of geography, that New Brunswick is halfway between Philadelphia and New York, and that shapes the music scene there. But it's also a community of alterity in some ways, in that the music scene wouldn't be, the information practices have to be contextualized in a punk DIY ethic. So there's no hard and fast lines between alterity, place, and practice. So the research I'm going to talk about today is about the experiences of transnational migrants and becoming familiar with city space. And in a lot of ways, this grew out of a frustration with how we tend to talk about technology and mobility. So in popular discourses of technology, the progress narrative dominates. And what I mean by this is a narrative in which technology is helping us send information faster and maintain, intimate ties that we often say collapse geographic distance. So take this picture, for example. It might look like an ad for Mac laptops, but it's in fact from this summer. And those are my two sisters, and that's me in the laptop. And they were Skyping me in. I was in a hostel in Zadar, Croatia, and they were Skyping me in for my now sister-in-law's bridal shower. Now, the power of ICTs, information communication technologies, the power of ICTs like Skype in this moment were undeniable. At that afternoon, my sister hadn't heard my voice in about 3 months, and she hadn't seen my face in real time in about 6 months. And when my head first popped onto the laptop, she burst into tears. And I was very grateful to Skype in that moment because I could participate in this event with my family in a real-time, intimate way that I probably wouldn't have been able to without Skype. But there's another way of looking at this story. I'm far from the first person to point out that in the HCI, we often study events that are a lot like this one, a bunch of highly educated, white, middle-class women who, by the way, are celebrating a straight, white Christian marriage by buying presents that celebrate feminine domesticity. I dare you to come up with a more succinct image of hegemony than like this image contextualized, right? So what other stories can we tell of transnational communication? What stories can we talk about that are more about rupture than connectivity? Stories that we can tell that are more about play and improvisation rather than efficiency and business. So this brings me to my dissertation work, which is called Information Tactics in Urban Spaces, Portraits of Transnational Migration. And the key questions that I had going into this project were, how do transnational migrants make sense of new urban environments? What are the spatial, temporal, and social dimensions of information practices and technological practices among transnational migrants in new urban space? Now, I use the term transnational migrants for a couple reasons. Number one, it helps me sidestep some of the political charge around the term immigrant. And number two, it sort of opens up a less stereotypical notion of what immigrant usually calls to mind, right? So the people in my project, some of them, there was Midori from Japan, who had a really great postdoc at NYU, and then there was Julio from the Dominican Republic, who had been unemployed the entire time he had been in New York. So I had people with great jobs, people with no jobs, people who were in the country legally and illegally, people who had been to New York before, people who had never been there before, or that was their first time, and people who were there for the long haul, and people who were just going to be in New York for a few months. As an overarching theory for my research, I used Desserteau's work on tactics, strategies, and everyday negotiations of urban life. So in The Practice of Everyday Life, which is his big book from 1984, Desserteau described the city as a source of tension, where individuals are, struggling to exert their own agency and will against the dominating force of institutional infrastructure. So disserto identified meant attempts to maintain individual agency as tactics and the pressure of institutions as strategies. So I like to think of this as a politics of the interstitial. So if you imagine, strategies as the lattices and networks of things like crystals and atoms, tactics are the things that are going on in those spaces between. So they're supposed to be improvisational, playful, time-saving, the maneuvers that help you get through the institutional lattices. As a methodological framework, I use Garfinkel's notion of ethnomethodology. Ethnomethodology typically revolves around repeated qualitative interviews, where you're sort of trying to understand how people make sense of everyday lives. So I'm, again, from an human information behavior perspective, ethnomethodology is really appealing because it sort of talks about identifying patterns and organizational structures for making sense of everyday life. I'm not going to talk too much about ethnomethodology, but I'm happy to come back to it in the Q&A if you would like. So how did I get this done? I moved to New York about 9 years ago, and I started volunteering, teaching English as a second language, or ESL, about 6 years ago, long before I started my PhD work. So I tapped those networks in order to find 5 different recruitment sites throughout New York and Newark. So one was in Newark, New Jersey, another was in Manhattan. The other 3 were at public libraries in Brooklyn and Queens. So between September of 2011 and May 2012, I spent about 200 hours volunteering, teaching English as a second language, having one-on-one conversation partners, leading book groups. I taught classes on preparing for one's citizenship tests. So I kept all my subway cards and New Jersey Transit cards that I racked up during that period of time. But mostly it just meant a lot of time on my bike, which incidentally Microsoft bought for me when I was an intern here. So thanks, Microsoft. So as a result of all those hours of volunteering at all those research sites, I wound up with 18 different participants. I want to point out they are from 17 countries and they live in 17 neighborhoods in New York. I deliberately sought a very heterogeneous population. I wanted people from a large number of countries and a large number of places in the city so that I could talk about what practices emerged across those groups of people. One thing that they shared was an experience of newness in New York. So I screened participants for people who had been in the city for less than 2 years. Yes?
Which country had 2 people?
Japan. Yes. And the average length of time that people had been in New York was 11 months. I do have people from all 5 continents. No one from Antarctica, but if you know anyone, there's still a little bit of time for me to add them to this project. Not much. I'm defending on the 21st, but...
There's 2 together who were from the same country, given that there are also 17 neighborhoods.
Excuse me? Oh, no.
I don't know if the 2 Japanese were...
No. One was in...
Same neighborhood?
One was in Fort Greene, and the other one was in Midtown. Yeah. So I use 3 different qualitative research tools to do this work. So conversational interviews, which are also called unstructured interviews. They use interview themes more than specific interview questions. And I'm happy to talk more about what those themes were at the end. And when I could, I interviewed people repeatedly over the course of 6 to 12 months. I also use something called participatory maps, sometimes called cognitive maps, where we ask people to draw you a map of something, in my case, of their neighborhoods. And I coined the phrase participatory wandering. It refers to asking people to let me walk with them through their neighborhoods. So here are 2 of the maps that were drawn. I gave people blank pieces of paper and colored pencils and asked them to draw maps. This is Jersey City, and this is Midtown Manhattan. I like those 2 maps because I think they look a little bit alike, even though they're of technically different states. And I'll be bringing some other maps in as we go along. Also, participatory wandering is actually something that's fairly common in documentary film, right? This idea of asking someone to show you around their neighborhood and tell stories about it. But for whatever reason, we don't seem to use it as much in social science. So these blue lines are routes that where people took me with them on various things. Like I went grocery shopping in Chinatown with one of my participants. I went to a flea market. I was biking in Bushwick. On occasion, I would also go without the participants, and I would try and use the maps that they had given me as a guide for wandering through city space, and those are the pink lines. And then the blue push pins are 4 out of my 5 research sites. There's a 5th one in Newark, but it sort of threw off the perspective of the map. So I organized my finding around 3 different dimensions of information practices. I'm going to go very quickly over temporal dimensions, talk a little bit about social dimensions, and then spend most of my time on spatial dimensions of information practices. So in the chapter on temporal dimensions, because I had interviewed people often over the course of several months, and then again, by the time I had interviewed people, I often knew who they were anyway, because I'd spent all this time at the recruitment sites. So a lot of times, by the time I sat down with people, I already knew how long they'd been here and a little bit about their lives. So I was able to sort of have this much more longitudinal perspective of people's lives in New York. So I really tried to focus on that in this section on time in order to see how perceptions of city space change over time. So in this chapter, I use Bergson has this really beautiful definition of Henry Bergson. He's a philosopher who died around World War II. He has this really beautiful definition of habit. It's something that organizes your spatial surroundings. And so I tried to use that to think about practices that emerge in 2 instances. The first one, you have a moment of lostness, and then how do you develop practices to avoid moments of lostness in the future? And the second, perhaps a little more conceptually, I talk about the determination among many of my participants to avoid looking like a tourist. And in both of those cases, I'm really interested in how people use technology. In the chapter on social dimensions of information practices, I look specifically at the use of social network sites. And I contrast the use of Facebook, which was by far the most popular social network site among my participants, with Meetup in order to identify different affordances as well as obstacles of social network sites among transnational migrants. And so again, I was really interested in the fact that a lot of times when we talk about ICTs and transnationalism, the rhetoric is about the affordances of technology in terms of keeping in touch and maintaining ties. But there are also ways in which technology makes our lives much more complicated. So take, for example, the issue of language. So for 17 out of my 18 participants, English was not their first language. I had one participant from Australia, so she had a slightly different case. But for everybody else, there was the option of posting in at least 2 and sometimes more languages. Now, in a way, this was a real affordance, right? So I was thinking of Dina and Alice's work on how teens will sometimes use inside jokes or cultural references in order to guide messages they send to a certain part of their social network, like teens versus, their parents. But you can sort of do that with language, right? Because Facebook doesn't necessarily allow you to control the dissemination of your content across all your social networks. So, for example, Laura, she's from Brazil, she talks about posting in Portuguese versus English, and she likes posting in English because it helps her practice her English, but she'll post in Portuguese if it's something that's just about her family. So there's that same sort of sense of directing messages. But of course, directing the message that way is still documenting a signal to the rest of your network that they're excluded. And I use Judith Donna's work on signal theory in this chapter a lot, where she talks about interactions online as signaling things to your social network, a signal of care, a signal of affect. So Laura talks about the tension of, on the one hand, wanting to use language as a means of directing her content to one group versus another, but at the same time, the costs of doing that in terms of part of her social network feeling excluded. Other sources of tension emerged. So, for example, some participants talked about the fatigue of being expected to share information with their social networks abroad. Social media itself, in the way that it's structured, tends to encourage sharing. But for a number of reasons, transnational migrants might not want to share their New York lives with family elsewhere. Oh dear. Sorry, we were one ahead. Later on in this quote, Jacinta says, I would really love to use Facebook and Twitter serenely in the future, but for right now, I feel like I can't. So she talked about how she'd basically stopped using these sites because she felt like she was living too much in Mexico. She's from Mexico City. And I thought that was so interesting because a lot of times when we talk about social media use and transnationalism, we talk about the ease of maintaining ties and the facility of maintaining a sense of intimacy. But that's not how Jacinta experiences it. She experiences it as obligation. She experiences it as a source of tension. She does not experience it as anything like serenity. So my favorite example was from Rob. It's also the most extreme example. He moved from Puerto Rico to New York and promptly deleted all of his Puerto Rican friends from his Facebook network. This is the exact opposite of how we usually think of transnational use of things like Facebook. We think of it as Facebook is so great because it allows us to maintain ties with our friends and family abroad. And here Rob was saying, no, I wanted to start over, I wanted a new life, and that meant, deleting my friends from Facebook. And eventually your friends grow and you have this, documentation of your life on your social media site. And I thought that was interesting too because a lot of the initial concern over social network sites was that people were going to be finding strangers online and, oh gosh, what do we do? And then it turned out that people weren't finding strangers. They were really connecting with people they already knew. This is an incredible literalization of that, right? It's a literalization of your social network online looks exactly like it does in real life. Real life is now New York, and that's what my social network is going to reflect. So I want to spend a little bit more time talking about spatial dimensions of information practices.
Did people sometimes try to create two identities or not?
Well, the problem with that is,
Other than Facebook not really wanting you.
Facebook doesn't want you to do it. And then the other thing is Facebook sort of takes on this new life. So a lot of people talked about when, and again, this is tough because it varies so much from person to person, but people talked about I didn't use Facebook as much until I moved here. And then suddenly, I realized that it was important to people here. And so I had to check into that. And I think part of that is a New York thing. And I think part of that is maybe a US thing. So it's hard to say. There was a little bit more of, what really conforms to the norm of transnational use of ICTs is Skype. People use Skype to maintain ties with people abroad, and they do not use it to, chat with people that they met at the bar or, whatever. So that's the one that really maps pretty closely, but I didn't find that same thing on social media sites as much. So when I talk about space, I'm using a specific conceptualization of space that emphasizes the importance of interaction. So I'm using cultural geographers like Doreen Massey, David Harvey, Edward Soja, and particularly Henry Lefebvre. And when these theorists, they have their divergences. I just listed them in a group as if they all agree all the time, which they don't. But the important thing for me is that space is active and it requires social interaction. So a lot of times when we talk about the use of technology in space, we talk about it in sort of a lot of the HCI, human-computer interaction literature. It talks about we're going to design this thing and then we're going to deploy it in urban space and just see what happens. And hopefully, a lot of times there's really civic engagement in mind. Like we want to foster dialogue. I'm about to create an exaggerated caricature, but it's actually not that far off if you read a lot of this literature. It really reminds me of those like Hollywood sets of like a Western town where it's like those two-dimensional, like here's the saloon and here's the whatever. And that's space, right? It's inert and it's static and it's two-dimensional, and we don't think very much about the fact that space is actually very fluid and it's very, it changes over time and it's very much constructed by the social practices that go on there. So that's my theoretical construction of space, and sort of, it's intended to be very aware of social interaction and very aware of changes over time. So I identified two practices for navigating space that sort of go along with this conceptualization. On the one hand, I'm going to talk about wandering as a means of learning about space and neighborhoods as a means of talking about space. So I define wandering as a form of acquiring information about neighborhoods completely outside of formal information resources. And it uses informal, unstructured walks to acquire a kind of personal fluency in your neighborhood. Wandering is undirected, but a very deliberate engagement with city space. So often I found that wandering is incorporated into daily routines. So depending on how well you know Manhattan, I could draw it for you. So Manhattan is like this, right? And here's Midtown, right here. And so I'm talking about Midori. So she lived in Midtown and then she was going to her office in the East Village. Now Broadway goes like this. So I asked her about, how she got to work, and she said, well, I always walk and I take Broadway because it's the shortest way. And she's right. But when she's commuting, she often, just to break up the monotony of the routine, she will sort of like take a little sides route every now and then. You know, like this would be like one day, this would be the next day, just to break up her commute. And when she talked about that, she said it was an important means of learning about her neighborhood. You know, she would take these little side routes in order to find things and ask for specific things. She talked about finding restaurants, grocery stores that way. Incidentally, this absolutely backs up Jane Jacobs' work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she argues for short city blocks because it would facilitate wandering. She doesn't call it that, but that's her argument, and this is totally borne out in my work. Another example, Ishmael, who was a devout Muslim, he would talk about, you know, these various places that he had to be throughout the day. So his, you know, he was unemployed, but he would talk about where he lived, and then he would talk about where he volunteered, and he would talk about, you know, where he did his ESL learning, and then spiraling out from those places on his free time in order to find mosques where, if, you know, there were calls for prayers at those times, he would go find them. So here's his map of the Bronx. I know it's not the best, might be hard for you to see. So he lived in the Bronx, and he actually pointed out not one, not two, but 3 different mosques in his neighborhood. So that's where the arrows are pointing out. When I asked him how he chose to go to one mosque versus another, he would say, oh, it depends on the time of day, depends on whether or not I feel like being social. But his map sort of reflects this practice of wandering in order to find, in his case, something that he needed. He needed a working knowledge of where these things were throughout the day in order to comply with his religion. Wandering is also a practice that scales. So someone like Midori, who I mentioned earlier, wandering was mostly about finding out things in her neighborhood. But she was very nervous about leaving Manhattan, and she didn't even like going to certain neighborhoods that she felt were unsafe, like Harlem. And you contrast that to someone like Jorge, who lived in the Upper West Side, and he had this amazing quote elsewhere about, it's impossible to find information about my neighborhood on the internet. I have to walk around in order to find information, which I thought was this amazing rejection of a very technologically sophisticated practice for something that is much more rudimentary, arguably the least technological practice of just walking. But for Jorge, wandering is important about finding out about the Upper West Side, but he says, I hate people who live in the Upper West Side and they say, oh, I'm not going to Queens, I'm not going to Brooklyn, this is so, so awful, I mean, you're losing things. It's like saying, I don't read books. It's the same. And I thought that was such a great quote. So for him, wandering isn't just about the neighborhood, it's about the city as a whole. Obviously, this opens up a whole thing about the city as library, which is just like incredibly appealing to me, but we'll set that aside for the moment. So as an information practice, I'm interested in contrasting wandering to the use of online maps. So of course, there's no hard and fast line between wandering as a non-technological practice and online maps as a profoundly technological practice. Lots of people use technology when they wander. They might use guidebooks, they might use their iPods, they might use smartphones. But their motivations for using these technologies are different than when you're just using an online map. So a lot of my participants would talk about wandering as something that opened them up to social interaction and as a deep engagement with their surroundings, whereas the use of online maps was frequently characterized as I was looking something up on my phone, and then somehow I got where I was supposed to be, and I have no idea how I got there. And if you asked me to recreate that walk right now, I couldn't tell you anything that happened. And I think we sort of intuitively experience this a lot ourselves when we use maps, but it was nice to have like grounded data that suggested the same thing. But it also opens up a difference between these two things as information practices, where there's essentially a trade-off in short-term convenience of finding a route efficiently with a long-term disengagement from city space. So I was also interested in tracking different means of talking about space. So participants referenced a number of tactics for making sense of city space. So in terms of the industry that might be there, or in terms of the architecture, or in terms of race, you know, who lives in those neighborhoods. But I was particularly interested in 2 different tactics of talking about neighborhoods. And one is to talk about the social norms for a particular space. So here's Jacinta. She works in Midtown, and she made this casual reference when we were talking to Midtown rules. And I said, Midtown rules, what are those? She says, oh, Midtown rules are very clear. You know what time everything's going to be closed. You know that on weekends no one will be here. You know that everyone's in a hurry, that everything's a grid, you know, Grand Central. And she went on to say, you know, she got very thoughtful, and she said, you know, the thing is, in terms of knowing where to go in Midtown, Midtown makes total sense to me. But in terms of interaction, I don't get it. I'm from Mexico City. Mexico City is not orderly, it's chaotic, so I love spaces like Chinatown. I love spaces like the Village. Those make more sense to me in terms of the way I'm going to act there, even if I don't understand where I'm going in that space. And I think that really sort of opens up a question of how our maps of urban space would look if we were more interested in the social practices that go on there feeling familiar, rather than the architecture or the infrastructure feeling familiar. Also, that definitely points back to someone like Lefebvre, who talks about space as socially constructed. Another means of talking about space that really interested me came from Jorge, who was talking about rejecting norms of how we draw boundaries around space. So he says, parts of Bushwick, they're not really Bushwick. I like my neighborhood in the Upper West Side between, this 20-block span, but outside of that, I really don't like it. He sort of rattles off this list of neighborhoods that he does or doesn't agree with their, general reputation. And what I read into that is an assertion of tactical neighborhoods versus strategic neighborhoods. He is coming up with his own means of talking about city space that may or may not conform with the strategic means of talking about city space. It really actually reminded me of this project by Chisholm and Cohen. So they created this API where you can populate a map based on Craigslist Wanted. Craigslist ads for apartments. So what you see here is a dot corresponding to the color of what someone says the neighborhood is versus where it actually is in space. So you can sort of see, I don't know how familiar you are with San Francisco, but no one wants to sell an apartment that's in the Tenderloin, right? Because that's where drug use and prostitution has historically gone. So no one calls it the Tenderloin. People only call it the Civic Center, right? So there is this question of how do you create maps of space that reflect both the social norms that go on there, but the idea that you might assert your own neighborhood boundary for a number of reasons. It's actually what someone like Arjuna Padre would call the production of new cartographies. So in thinking about these information practices in terms of their implications for theory and design, I link wandering to a larger resistance to progress and efficiency narratives in technology. So lately we've seen sort of a resurgence in interest of other metrics for evaluating technology. You can think of slow food. There's actually a book called Slow Reading. It's awesome. Huh? It's short. It's like 100 pages. Because I'm a librarian, I'll give you, here's the last name, and it's at Litwin Press. This is the advantage of having a librarian around. Putting stuff up there. Go read it. So there's this interest in slow narrative, right? The slower narratives of technology. There's another thing going on at the other Cambridge lab, an interest in slow search, right? Like what would our use of the internet look like if we were interested in slower search rather than faster search? So I link wandering to this same interest in slowness, where we're talking about information practices that are measured in terms of depth and personal engagement, not to mention pleasure. And I think the pleasure of wandering is actually part of the problem, where when we think about city space where we make room for pleasure, we think of the city space in terms of wandering, it's spaces of pleasure, spaces of leisure, like public parks, like that's where we expect to wander. But how would city space be different if we took seriously the affordances of wandering as a practice of slowness? Imagine a world where we didn't have online maps that were just about public transportation mode and walking mode and biking mode. Why couldn't we have a wandering mode? What would that look like, and what would it get us? In terms of urban policy, a lot of the policies that emerge around urban space and technology are initiatives that have a lot to do with speed and progress. So I'm thinking here of the push to have fully wireless cities, or to have information stands and strategic, and I use that word deliberately, places to update citizens of information. But a lot of my research points to the need to foster technological forms of play that can encourage social interaction between people and space. And I think we're already seeing some of that emerge when it comes to things like flash mobs or even geocaching, right? People's engagement with space in terms of technology. But I'm not sure how much these games actually foster social interaction. I think it's a lot more about, the spatial interaction is there, but what about the social dynamic? What about the social element? And moreover, I think a lot of times we focus too much on really sophisticated technologies where a broader definition of technological engagement would serve us really well. I don't have that much time to talk about future directions of my work, but I did want to point to a couple projects that I'm in the very early stages of conceptualizing or researching. So in my dissertation, I was really struck by the extent to which online maps are deployed across a range of everyday interactions, as well as a spectrum of technologies. So in that analysis, I argue that even as maps are highly personalized and that they accompany us on a range of personal technologies, they don't necessarily lead to a very personalized engagement with city space. So to really sort of press on that tension a little bit more, I want to study two groups of people for whom knowledge of urban space is both professionally and personally important. And those groups of people are bike messengers and ambulance drivers. This is actually a picture of my friend Christian biking with Mess Collective, which is a collective of bike messengers. So in this project that I'm imagining, I want to combine ethnographic interviews with participant observation, looking to identify the technical as well as the social affordances of online maps in moving through urban environments. So the questions that I have are sort of like, what are the cartographic practices that emerge when you have to find your way through city space? What are the acts of spatial translation as you move from an abstract online map to a digital, to a grounded reality of the street? How are these tactics communicated to others? And from a theoretical standpoint, sort of complicated by those tactics being subsumed into institutional strategies. And then what possibilities are there for spatial, what I would call spatial articulations of resistance? And whether that's just deciding that you're not going to take the prescribed route, whether that's deciding you're going to break traffic laws and go a different way, whether that's deciding you're going to hide from your coworkers, the routes you have for getting from place to place. I think those are all really interesting questions as far as using technology to navigate city space. The other project that I want to return to is an investigation of online subcultures. And I'm really interested in how individuals manage norms of care in online worlds as a counterpublic. So partly this would involve going back to the body modification community because questions of self-care are so evident, right? I mean, there's literally questions about like, how do I care for this modification? But also bringing in other online subcultures to sort of have a broader discussion about how the technical structures of a site, such as managing insiders and outsiders, and privacy and self-disclosure, affect the social norms of care. So when members of a community share interests that are stigmatized by the mainstream, how are the ethics of online membership defined and enforced, both socially and technologically? So as a whole, what happens with these projects is that I use technology as a focal point, partly because I want to contribute to designing better technology. And when I say better, I don't actually mean faster. I mean better in that it encourages social interaction, and also that maybe it's more ethically designed, more informed in terms of different possibilities for using it. But I'm really also, on the one hand, I'm actually interested in these questions of technological design, but I'm also interested in the technologies that emerge as an opening up for asking other questions of power and privilege. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you guys so much for coming and for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback. Kate.
Thank you so much, Jessa. I want to take your provocation seriously for a minute about how we might reconceptualize maps as a space for wandering, and to actually press you on what you commented on at the end, that you were interested in contributing to the design of better technology. Let's say, for example, we were thinking about rolling out a new mapping service. How would you take this kind of research to reconceptualize what maps could do? And how would you advise to designers that they think through the kinds of richness that you found through this wandering mode?
So the first thing would be we need to stop thinking of mapping as a means of getting from point A to point B. So the efficiency of, here's your entry point and here's your exit point, and those being the stopping and starting. So I'm interested in taking away that ethic. And instead I'm interested in saying, how would we map the route between these spaces in a way that maximizes engagement with your surroundings and social interaction? So 2 things that I can think of. Number 1 would be, there's this great Deleuze quote, a Deleuze and Guattari quote about maps as malleable, as changeable, as things that you break apart and put back together. So I would literalize that and have the roots of mapping being something that you could make collectively, something that you could alter, something that you could add stories to, something that you could add pictures to. And I think we have some of those things in mind, but it's often about, so when you upload a Google map and you drill down, it actually allows you to tag like photos, and it allows you to see wiki posts and whatever, and that's great. But what would it be like if you could just like move those photos around and say that photo isn't here anymore, that photo is of somewhere else? You know, the sort of idea of configuring things and allowing for updating things. And the thing that you lose there is the sense of someone else's deep attachment to space, but you're opening it up to a more collective knowledge and sort of a more sense of configurability rather than that sense of stasis. So I would do that. The other thing that's really important to me is from a privacy perspective. What concerns me about practices of mapping is these questions of I'm uncomfortable with people knowing where I'm going all the time. And so I would want anything that took seriously this practice of mapping to be very cognizant of privacy. And I think part of what you get out of this willingness to play with routes is it's no longer an accurate record of how you got from point A to point B. It's a record of something else. So those are 2 of the things that come to mind right away. Documentation of everyday life, opening things up so that people could configure it, and then also being very cognizant of privacy.
And just one quick follow-up. You mentioned maximizing social interaction. How would you think about an introvert's map of the city?
That's a good question. I think lots of people have introverts maps of the cities all the time. So actually I was thinking as I was walking over here, both when I was here for the summer and when I was in the other Cambridge for the summer. When I was here for the summer, because I already knew I was going to be doing this project, I kept a list of every time I had to use a map to find out where I was. And I didn't allow myself to use Google Maps, right? So I had this like very introverted, and I was sort of humiliated by my own, like what do you do when you can't use Google Maps to get around? And I would get lost all the time with all these things. And when I was in Cambridge last summer, I decided I was going to draw a map every day of getting from point A to point B, but it had to be a different map, and I also didn't allow myself to use street names. So I was really interested in, because by then I'd already done the research for this, and I was really frustrated that so many of the maps relied on street names and didn't show landmarks, and so I was determined to force myself to do landmarks. So all of this is a way of saying I'm very aware of introverted maps, because these maps of privacy and these maps of lostness. So I think one thing would be to open up again a space where maps are, I think a lot would have change if we got rid of the ethic of maps being from route finding and then ethics of map instead being about storytelling. And I think that people have these introverted maps all the time, and it would just be a way of making it possible for people to share them, perhaps by getting rid of that ethic of, but that's not the fastest route. Nancy.
I'm thinking about those alternative role-playing games that try to do this, right? Like, just this morning, people were tweeting about using Ingress, where it's like a spy reality game.
Okay.
There's a bunch of these for different cities where they're interactive and they're online, and they're really designed to force you to wander cities in unexpected ways on treasure hunts or missions that you never would have come up if you were looking at Google Maps or one of those, the 5 highlights of the city kind of thing. Do you have any thoughts about those games?
Yes, I do. So one of the things that I do in my conclusion is I try and talk about, like on the dissertation, I try and come up with like a checklist for games that would meet my criteria of social spatial play, because I think we are seeing a lot of these games, a lot, increasingly. And what's so interesting about them is people will talk about, I'm in this neighborhood all the time, and they don't say it, but you also know that they're using the same technology all the time. So they look the exact same to a lot of, like if you were just walking by them, then you'd be like, there's a dude standing with a smartphone on this street corner, and he looks like he's going to work. But he has this very different experience of the space around him because there's the artifice of this game. My only thing about the games is that, again, a lot of them don't actually encourage social interaction between strangers. They encourage social interaction, like it's a game you play with your friends, right? So it's sort of about geocaching. So a lot of times it's games you play individually or with your friends. And I'd like to see that be more something that opens up interactions with other people. So that's where I'm thinking about those games in terms of like how can we get strangers involved. But I also think, I'm not a game designer, so I'm probably not gonna, and I think a lot of games are exciting. The one other thing that I would say is a lot of these games are taking place in urban space, but I'm really interested in games that we could play in the suburbs or games that we could play in rural spaces. Because I've lived in rural spaces and they have a very different set of storytelling practices around space a lot of times. It actually tends to be much more temporal. My mind was blown when I moved. I mean, this is gonna sound like a caricature, but it happened. I was asking how to get somewhere, and someone was like, "Oh, you just turn right at the house with the white picket fence. Oh wait, the fence is gone, but it used to be there, so just turn." And I was like, this doesn't make sense to me at all. But it makes a lot of sense in terms of temporal familiarity with space. And so sort of like tapping into those networks of like, how does space change over time? And that, like a longitudinal familiarity rather than a spatial familiarity. Dana.
Are you familiar with Waze?
With
W-A-Z-E?
I don't think so.
Waze is a very interesting mapping tool, in part because it's designed to try to get you, the individual user, to train its data to know more about things with an idea of optimizing for traffic flows in places that Google Maps does not pay attention to. So it's an Israeli produced object. What's interesting about it, as a complement to what you're talking about, is that there are 3 different relevant actors trying to shape the dynamics of that map. On one hand, you have the designers constantly trying to convince you to do things that will give it more data. So it puts up Pac-Man things all over the city, so it tries to encourage you to go certain places, in many ways, to wander according to you in order to give it data, right? And in addition, it invites you to put your own information on there for other users. So namely, you've got 2 very important icons you can put. You can put police officer, or you can put car crash, right, which are both meant to be signals, both, again, to the system, but also to the other user. But the reason I think it's an interesting pushback to some of what you're talking about is, how do you deal with this moment where you have 3 very different actor groups trying to design the system and to design behavior and try to move both the individual behavior and the collective behavior for all of these different purposes, right? And so part of what I'm trying to imagine this is pushing you away from the idea of the design of the system as a static process, but to try to think about that design as an interactive dance with the different constituencies that are engaged with it. And I'm curious how you would think about that version of design as opposed to the idea of designing in a very HCI, here's an object, go.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly like to think of myself as more in the latter camp than the former camp. That's certainly where I'm more comfortable. It's always like a shock to me when I'm like, oh, I have implications for design. That's unfamiliar. And then I, try and do that in the most responsible way that I can. But for one thing, I mean, just as an activist, right, and my own experiences being Occupy Wall Street or various other occupations where I protested, we didn't have the luxury of building new tools for talking to each other. We had to come up with our own tools. And so some of the technologies that we developed were very rudimentary, like hand signals and the people's mic. I mean, those are technologies of communication that matched our ethics. So I can imagine other scenarios, and I mean, things like Ushahidi, right, of using maps in order to document things. I mean, what makes me so nervous about the Waze thing that you just suggested is like, well, if we tell the police where we are, then they're just going to come arrest us from a protest perspective, right? So those questions. But I think it's important. Yeah, I completely agree with your point that it's important to identify different stakeholders. But I think it's also a cat and mouse game from my own perspective of finding a technology, being like, yes, I can't wait to reappropriate this, and then seeing it get subsumed back into the system. The other thing that I want to say about that is when I was talking about the bike messenger project and the ambulance project, I mean, a lot of that comes out of this real question of, this is another way of talking, the question of tactics and strategies, right? Like, in the workplace, your individual tactics can get subsumed into strategies. The story of Taylorism is a Descartesian story of, I had my own little tricks for getting something done, and then Taylor came along, and then it's like, and those little tricks and tactics suddenly got subsumed into institutionalized strategies, and now we have a more efficient workforce. And then what happened to your tactics? Well, they're strategies now. So from a design question standpoint, that's what I want to get at. From a design standpoint of maps, that's really what I want to get at with this question of bike messengers and ambulance drivers, is there's a real push to be efficient. And ambulance drivers, like people's lives are occasionally on the line. Although a lot of ambulance driving is honestly taking people to the hospital, and not who don't really. That's my sister was an ambulance driver, so that's where this project came from. But anyway, that tension of managing individual agency and individual sort of a sense of play within an institutionalized framework of design is something that I want to tackle in this next project. Megan?
Great talk. Really enjoyed it. I want to actually circle back a little bit to where you started your talk, talking about why some groups use technology in radically different ways and how looking at these cultural logics can kind of reflect back on power. I'm wondering if you can just kind of close the loop a little bit on that and talk about how your dissertation speaks to that. And then I guess the critique of rationalization of space is, it's pretty old. So I'm wondering what you're bringing to that by focusing on information practices as opposed to, you like Jane Jacobs and Manuel Castells and Janice Perlman and all these people since the 60s have really been looking at people's conceptions of space and how those don't map, Cody marks around it, to maps. So I guess, I'm wondering how you're pushing on those critiques.
So about the first question in terms of what do we learn by sort of setting aside the progress narrative of technology, or what do we learn when we study, communities of alterity? A lot of that comes for me out of a background in library and information science, where we have a history of talking about people who are working and people who are doing white-collar work, and sort of it's just more. When we look at technology outside those metrics, what do we get? So the reason I keep returning to things like, isn't Rob's use of Facebook crazy, is because, it's really, for me, important to study these moments of rupture, right? So there have been these calls for, but how do we, Jed's work here, right, on, people who depart from social network sites or whatever. I love that work, and I see, I wasn't looking for that in this project deliberately, but I was excited when it came out, because I think it provides a counter-narrative to how we think of social network sites and the affordances that they give us. So moments like that are sort of part of my overall interest. Also things like, definitely people in my project use social media to keep in touch with families back home, but they're also doing other things, and I think that says something about the affordances of social media, but other things too, like the affordances of maps for asserting one's own individual relationship to space over a strategic relationship to space. So I think that's part of my broader interest, both as an information scientist who's sort of determined to operate outside this context of, how do we get the most, I won't even make that exaggeration, but outside of an information scientist perspective of the workplace or of information retrieval, and sort of much more of an interest, a sociological interest in how people use information in everyday life. So I hope that answered your question, probably the first one.
Kind of, yeah.
I guess the other way of coming at it is.
I guess I want to know specifically sort of how you speak to questions of power. And especially because I think information sciences is so weak on theorizing power that there's clearly a lot of space. But yeah, so I guess I'm interested in specifically that aspect.
So again, for people who are disenfranchised of the people that I studied, right, and there are people who are not, right? There are people who had a lot of privilege, and there are people who really didn't. For them, one of the ways this project got started for me was doing work with ESL population for 2 or 3 years, and it sounds almost. I found almost embarrassed by how humbled I was at the lives of people, and I was just I had a hard enough time moving from California to New York, and here you are, and you don't have a job, and you barely speak the language, and what does the city look like to you when I have all these affordances of education and language, no money, but education and language, and the city must look different to you. Does it look different to you? And sort of trying to unpack, how does the city look differently to you? And because I'm an information scientist, the ways that I approach that are what are the information practices that you need, and what are the technologies that you need? So someone like Julio, who again was unemployed, living in with his 3 generations of his family. It's almost stereotypical, his life. And he would use information as a kind of social capital. And he was very proud of moments where he could tell his relatives things that they didn't know about the city because he was newer. But this was, I mean, he had to occupy his time somehow. And so he would wander through city space. He was very proud of this moment where he was like telling someone the fastest way to get to this outlet mall in New Jersey. And he was like, my relatives didn't know that, and they've been here for 5 or 6 years. And I figured it out because I found this flyer on a bus. And well, that's a moment where information is powerful because it speaks to part of his social network. You know, and it gives him a very rare moment of feeling like he has information that other people in his life don't. And so I think moments like that where we're not interested as information scientists in that information as, you know, the power of that information is not how to get from point A to point B. It's in the social context of his lived life. Your other question was about rationalizations of space. So I'm with you on that. I mean, partly it's that I see this project as speaking to information science, and I see this project as speaking to providing lived accounts of globalization, because I feel like a lot of globalization theory tends to be very theoretical. So there's, I mean, Arjun Appadurai, I took a class with him one time, and he made a joke, but I felt like he almost kind of wasn't joking, where he's like, that's fine in practice, but how is it in theory? And I was like, oh dear. So I see my work as sort of providing a grounded, lived account of transnationalism that can speak to things that he would be interested in speaking to, like transnationalism, like post-national cartography. So I see myself as situating in that discipline rather honestly than the space discipline. So I'm interested in using those frameworks, but maybe not trying to disrupt those notions of space as much. And it's certainly not out of, I mean, I had the most fun writing about space because I enjoy theories of space, but I'm not speaking to those, do you know what I mean? I'm not really trying to disrupt those disciplines as much as my own and maybe globalization studies.
I think we're at noon on the ball, so if any of you wanted to follow up with Jessa, feel free to let me know and I'll get you in.
My time is not my own today, so thank you.